Michael Gordon, looking back on the week, how different has it been to what Tony Abbott may have expected?
Well, I don't think he could have anticipated it being such a shocker. This was a week that was going to start a new session of Parliament. He had a theme of growth and jobs. He was going to launch it with announcing the emissions reduction target they were going to take to Paris, and put pressure on Labor to say if they were going to be more ambitious, how they were going to do it without hurting consumers. And I don't think there has been a more shambolic or messy week for this government, with the possible exception of that week in February when there was a move against his leadership.
On the issue of same-sex marriage, we saw that marathon meeting back earlier in the week. How damaging has that been, if you like, for the government's political standing with the public?
Well, again, I think very damaging, more for what flowed from it. I think a number of the participants were very satisfied with the way it was conducted, and were saying things like they were privileged to be part of it. The problem was that this issue had not gone to the Cabinet, so there'd been no discussion at the highest level of government on what they were going to do with it, and it just took a life of its own. So that from a joint party room meeting mid-morning, reconvening at 3 o'clock, and then going into the night with and then what follows is very, very different views coming from very different cabinet ministers, exposing a deeply divided cabinet and with a very unclear path ahead.
There is the issue itself, but there's many people in the electorate who probably aren't that passionate about the issue of same-sex marriage, yet they're looking at a government where you have Christopher Pyne, a very senior minister, essentially accusing the Prime Minister of branch stacking by including the Nationals in that party room meeting. You've had this public disagreement between Scott Morrison and George Brandis. I mean, it's not a good look for the government, is it? No,
and I think there's multi layers here. That there was a vote for the Speaker's ship too. Before that, there was the Bronwyn Bishop issue, and who was supporting her to stay, and who wasn't, and who believed the Prime Minister acted way too late, which I think most did. So there are a whole lot of issues and factors that sort of were flowing through this, and then you saw these big differences emerge on the substance of the thing, of whether the way to resolve this is by referendum, which I frankly think is a crazy idea that was put up by Scott Morrison, but supported by many others, and many others who believe this was a way to kill off the issue, versus the plebiscite put by others, versus just settling it now put by Malcolm Turnbull.
And then, of course, we saw this story explode about the Royal Commissioner, Dyson Heydon. How does that play into the narrative of the week, if I can put it like that?
Well, it's just, again, it involved Liberal Party fundraiser, so that is a reminder of the whole entitlements issue. Whether it was a very bad judgment on the part of the New South Wales Liberal Party or a bad judgment on the part of the Royal Commissioner, and it was probably a bit of both, it was just a terrible look. And whatever you say about whether he thought it was a fundraiser or not, it was clearly he'd been negotiating with the organisers who were organising an event on behalf of the New South Wales Liberal Party, and it was a terrible look.
So what does this do for the authority of Tony Abbott within his own party room?
Well, because that came sort of out of left field after what had been a terrible week, I think MPs are stunned and are wondering where this is going to go. But a common phrase put to me, something's got to give. So I think we're back in that territory where can Tony reset, or will one of the possible leadership contenders challenge? And clearly Scott Morrison has been positioning himself to be a sort of a rise through the middle. The real pressure is on Malcolm Turnbull, because he's been at odds with a number of the calls that have been controversial this year going back to citizenship, going back to the way Tony Abbott described the war on Islamic State, going to the ABC, going to Bronwyn Bishop, I expect. So I think there's a real there is a pressure there to at what point does he say enough's enough and put his hand up.
So as far as you can ascertain, the leadership is once again very much a live issue within the Liberal Party room?
I believe so, but the point I make is that I don't think there are I don't think there are discussions going on, but they're at a I can't believe it stage, that it's come to this again, than a resolve to act stage. But it wouldn't surprise me if something happened quite quickly.
So how do you think this might develop? Say Parliament's back again next week. What are you looking for?
Well, again, we've got the Liberal Party, the party room meeting on the Tuesday. There'll be again the Prime Minister trying to reset and focus on his issues, but there is still big questions to answer about even do they go the referendum route or a plebiscite route? And the point that hasn't been made about the referendum so far is that would. The idea that you would have two referendums at different times next term is just ludicrous. And if you were to persist with that, you would be effectively sabotaging the Indigenous recognition referendum, which, as we know, Tony Abbott is very, very supportive of and said he would sweat blood for, versus a plebiscite. And I think a quick decision to move for a plebiscite, which could be much less costly, which could be done, they could explore with electronic voting, they could do a range of things to allow the public to express a view on this. And I do think that that Malcolm Turnbull's suggestion of a plebiscite before the election would be one way of getting this issue off the agenda. So I think that's the focal point is, and I assume that will be discussed at Cabinet on Monday, what they do about the way forward on same-sex marriage.